So we're now being recorded, so we can start. We're on in Sanhedrin, obviously, and we are on page 11a. It is, let's share the screen with you so that you can have the on. It's on page 55, I think, of the, page 55. If you're in the art scroll, not the art scroll, if you're in the Steinsaltz Gemarah, I will share the screen with you now for those of you that don't have it. There we go. Right, so we had spoken in the couple of shiurim before the break. We had spoken, I'm just going to shut the door one sec. We've got some builders doing rather noisy things downstairs. We had spoken about a man called Shmuel HaKatan and how he was a very humble person. And we spoke about several examples in Tanakh of people who had, as it were, spared the blushes of a sinner by sort of grouping them all together and not singling them out as sinners. That's where we had got to last time. And we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, where he had said to the whole people, why are you not keeping my mitzvot? After just one person had gone out and collected the man on Shabbat, or tried to collect the man on Shabbat when it wasn't there. And instead of singling him out, he spoke about the whole people to spare his blushes. We spoke about earlier on where one of the Tanaim had taken the blame, as it were, or at least tried to take the blame and deflect the blame for an illicit relationship. And it ended up with everybody giving a get to a particular woman, and all the other gittin, of course, were invalid apart from the one who actually needed to give her a get. And so that's where we stop now. That's what we did last time. Now, on the back of that, one of the Gemara's famous tangents coming up now. On the back of that, we're going off at a complete tangent. And since we mentioned Shmuel HaKatan in the last section, we're going to talk a bit more about this particular personality. And as you'll see, it leads us into some interesting, rather unworldly, this-worldly anyway, experiences. So we got to this little symbol over here is the symbol that the Steinsaltz Gemarah uses to tell us that this is a new, or a newish anyway, subject. So that's where we stop. So we'll carry on from this point here. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, Mi shemetu neviim ha'achronim. Once the last prophets passed away, and who were the last prophets? Haggai, Zachariah, Malachi. Once they had died, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael. The divine spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, whatever that means, prophecy, stopped. Now that sounds a bit of an obvious thing to say, doesn't it? Once the last prophets died, there was no prophecy. Well, obviously, that's why they were the last prophets, because there was no prophecy after them. But it doesn't quite say that. It doesn't say, Misha Metu Neviim Achronim Nistalka Neviut, prophecy stopped. Ruach HaKodesh stopped. Divine spirit. We need to just put that on the back burner for a minute, because we need to understand eventually what it means by Ruach HaKodesh, because it's one of those expressions which is used quite commonly in Orthodox Jewish circles, and it means different things to different people. So, for example, somebody said, I used it the other day. Now, in what context did I use it? I can't remember. Somebody asked me something, and I must have guessed that they had said or done something. And they said, how did you know that? And I said, oh, Ruach HaKodesh. It had come to me in a flash of divine spirit. So, for example, Rashi often speaks about Ruach HaKodesh. How did for example, how did we're told that the Avot kept the Torah? How could they keep the Torah? The Torah wasn't even given. Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirit. They understood through the divine spirit that there were a mitzvot that they had to do. It's an expression that means something which comes from above, something which can't be explained in normal worldly circumstances. And according to this Gemarah, according to the sages, once these three last prophets passed away, there was no further Ruach HaKodesh, which is a bit of a problem, really, because Ruach HaKodesh is ascribed to people in history after this. So that's why we need to understand exactly what Ruach HaKodesh means. But what period are we talking about? When did Haggai, Zachariah, Malachi, when did these three last prophets live? And more importantly, for our circumstances here, when did they die? Anybody know historically the time period we're talking about of these last prophets of Haggai, Zachariah, Malachi? When did they live? Anybody know? Have a guess. Leon, you've looked it up, haven't you?
Yeah.
Second, I knew you would have done. Okay, anybody not looked it up before we ask Leon? Anyone have a guess when you think that these last three prophets died or lived before I tell you, before Leon tells you, having looked it up? Have a guess. Come on, somebody have a guess. Avril Gatov, when do you think they lived? No idea. Johnny? Can't hear you. Unmute, Johnny.
75 CE.
75 CE.
Oh, BEC, is it?
So,
no, I don't know. I don't know.
All right. Leon, tell us, when did they live?
Well, it was just after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Oh.
No, I think the destruction of the First Temple.
First Temple.
Yeah. They lived in the 5th and 6th century BCE. So they lived between about 450 and 550 BCE. One sec, Sharon, I'll come to you in one sec. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. The First Temple, well, there's a dispute as to when it was exactly when it was destroyed, but it was destroyed in the 6th century BCE, so 500 and something, dispute whether it's 516, 526 or 545, but around about that time. And these prophets lived at the end of that period. So and we know that there was a 70-year exile in Babylon, and then the people started to come back. These three prophets were instrumental in the return to Zion of the remnants of the Jewish people from Babylon to start the building of the Second Temple. So they were, if you like, the first pioneers. We talk about the first Yishuv being in the late 19th century, and that's correct, of course, for the modern state. The first settlers started to come end of the 19th century.
Chovevei Tzion.
Yeah, Chovevei Tzion. They were the ones that started the return to Zion in the modern world. But Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the originals. They were the original returnees to Zion. Every time on a Shabbat or a Chag, when you say Birkat HaMazon, when you do your benching, you say beforehand, don't you? Shir HaMa'alot. Shir HaMa'alot, Shuva Hashem et Shivat Tzion. That was a prayer that was said by the exiles in Babylon. Shir HaMalot, it's a praise to a song of the heights. Shuva Hashem, Hashem, please return et Shivat Zion, those who are going to return, the returnees to Zion. It was a prayer during the exile for the return to Zion. And that is the subject of that Shir HaMalot that we all say and we all know off by heart and probably don't really know exactly what we were referring to. It's referring to the returnees to Zion. And these three prophets were the major leaders at that time to bring back the people from Babylon. Now, we've mentioned this a few times in the past. It was only a small proportion of the people in Babylon that returned, similar to what happened in our own times. Initially, when the first Yishuv and even the second Yishuv, it was a very small fragment of the Jewish people that came back to the land. This was the same in the times of Haggai, Zachariah, and Malachi, and Ezra, who we'll talk about in a minute. It was the same thing. Most of the people stayed in Babylon. And why did they stay in Babylon? Because they were very comfortable there. They'd made themselves a nice little niche there. They'd become part of Babylonian society. They had their own society there. Very similar to what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries in Chutz La'aretz, in America, in the UK, in Europe. That the Jews became settled and they didn't really want to go back to the Holy Land at that time because it was desolate. It had been thoroughly destroyed and ransacked by the Babylonians when they destroyed the first temple. The land was desolate. The people were all in exile. There was almost no Jews there left in the land. And so the people that Haggai, Zachariah, and Malachi brought to the land were in fact very brave pioneers. They were going to an empty, desolate land, and they tended to be the poor nebuchs, really, because as a friend of mine once said when he made Aliyah after his businesses had failed for the fourth time, he said, if I'm going to be poor, I might as well be poor in the sunshine. He had nothing to keep him in Chutz La'aretz, so he decided, well, I'll try again in Israel. Might as well be poor in the sunshine as be poor in the rain. And I think that was perhaps why it was the poor people that tended to go back with Haggai, Zachariah, and Malachi, because the rich people had too much to lose. They were comfortable in Bavel. So these three prophets, they were active at the time of the return to Zion, at the beginning of the period of the building of the second temple. And before I go on further on that, I'm aware that Sharon wanted to add something.
No, I really wanted to ask, were these prophets born in exile or were they part of the exiled people? And how did they relate to Ezra and Nehemiah? And what happened to them once they got back to Israel with the group of people? Were their prophecies made in Babylonia, or were their prophecies made to the people who had returned and were scrubbing out a living here?
Right. Okay. Good question. So the return began in around about 535, 540 BCE. The Babylonian Empire by that time had been taken over by the Persian and Median Empire. We know that, don't we, from the Megillat Esther, Achashverosh, who was the king. He was the king of Paras Umadai. He was the king of Persia and Media. So, excuse me, the ascendant power at that time was Persia. The king, who was Achashverosh's grandson, Cyrus, gave permission to the Jews to return to the land of Israel, which they controlled, and to rebuild the temple. But nothing actually happened because the economic and political situation at that time was dire. And what happened was Haggai and Zechariah, who were in Bavel at the time, they were the leaders who passionately pleaded the case for Zionism, if you like, the first form of Zionism. I suppose Haggai and Zechariah were the equivalent of Weizmann and Herzl. I don't think they'd probably thank me for that, because certainly on a religious level, Weizmann and Herzl didn't measure up to Haggai and Zechariah. But in terms of the Zionist enterprise, if you like, they were the equivalent. Zechariah and Haggai were the ones that were pushing the people, and they encouraged the people to return to the land. I'm quoting from a book here called Haggai and Zechariah, a very imaginative title. And it says here, Haggai and Zechariah must be given enormous credit for using their prophetic ministries to foster the transition of a people from national autonomy to an existence which transcended political definition and which centered upon a view of God and his moral demands. So what they had done is they managed to get the people to go back to the land, and at the same time engineered a religious revival and made it so that they wanted to build the temple. The Book of Zachariah is actually split into two, and there are some opinions that believe that actually it was written by two different people, i.e. the first Zechariah and the second Zechariah. And it's a very difficult book, actually, if you look at it. It's full of all sorts of prophecies and visions and angels and all sorts of symbolism, and very, very heavy on ethical pronouncements. But its main message is a message of hope. We spoke about it when we spoke about the Valley of the Bones. We spoke about it when we spoke about the idea of Ephraim's stick and Yehuda's stick coming together. Ephraim being the symbol of the 10 tribes, Yehuda being the symbol of the southern kingdom. It's very prophetic in its language, but actually on the ground, they were the ones that encouraged people to return to Israel. Malachi, on the other hand, was slightly later. Malachi came after Zechariah. He was the last of the prophets altogether. We don't actually know who Malachi was. We're not told anything about him. His name means Malachi, my king, or my messenger, as it was my malach, i.e. God's messenger. So Malachi, my messenger, is the name of God. It was God's messenger. And the whole spirit of Malachi's book, if you read the book of Malachi, is that the temple needed to be rebuilt. And it tells you there that actually what happened was they started to build the temple, but they sort of lost interest in it. They didn't have enough money. It was a pretty poor effort. And the whole thing was shelved for quite a number of years until Ezra and Nehemiah came along and got it going again. So if you like, if I continue with my comparison, Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah were the Weizmann and Herzl of the time, and Ezra and Nehemiah were the Ben Gurion and Begin of their time. They came a little bit later on and sort of finished the task off, if you like. So that's just to give you an idea of where we're coming from. And what I just want to show you, I just wanted to put some historical perspective on that before we carry on in the Gemarah. But I want to show you that Malachi is something which you will be familiar with, or at least the last verse of Malachi. Malachi is only a very small book. The last two verses of Malachi are very well known to you. Anybody know what they are without looking? Shame Ruby's not here. He would know for sure. David, do you know the last two verses of Malachi? He's staying.
Yeah, it's about Hinanochi Sholeach et Eliyahu Navi. The Haftarah of Shabbat Hagadol.
Correct. Let me share the screen with you. Well done, David. You get the brownie points today. There it is on the screen for you. I hope you can see that. I've lost you. Don't know where you've gone. There you are. Got you back again. Can you see the screen there? Yeah. There's the last pasuk, 23 and 24. Hinei anochi sholeach lachem. Behold, I will send for you et Eliyahu Navi. I will send you Elijah the prophet, of course, who's long since gone. I will send him lifnei bo yom Hashem, before the coming of the great start again. Lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanora. Yom hagadol v'hanora, the great and awesome day of Hashem. So this is where we get the idea from, that before the coming of Mashiach, whatever that means, Eliyahu Navi will herald the coming of Mashiach. Behold, I will send for you Eliyahu Navi before the coming of the great and awesome day of Hashem, i.e. the coming of Mashiach. So when we were all little and in Hebrew school of one sort or another, and we're painted the picture of Mashiach, the man, arriving on his white donkey and changing the world, we had before us that picture of Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, heralding that he would come before Mashiach, and this is where that idea comes from. Julia, you were shaking your head. You never were taught that in Hebrew school, that the Mashiach will come on a white donkey?
I was never taught anything about the Mashiach at Cheder. All I did was translate the Torah.
Oh, okay. What about you, Johnny? I bet you were told that Mashiach would come on a white donkey and Eliyahu Navi would come before him, yeah? Yeah. So that's where it comes from. You want to know where that whole idea comes from? That's where it comes from. And then the last verse of Malachi. Leon, do you have Malachi in front of you?
Yes.
Good, because I would like your beautiful voice to say this, because this is one of my favorite psukim in the entirety of Tanakh. I absolutely love this pasuk, and I would like Leon to read this for us.
Behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and awesome day of Hashem.
Go on, the next one.
That's the last one.
Yeah, the last one. That's the one.
I'm sorry. Yes, I've taken it from the bottom of the page. And he will turn back to God the hearts of fathers with their sons and the hearts of sons with their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with utter destruction.
Now, why is that such a favorite pasuk of mine? I actually don't like that translation that you just did. Do it again, Leon. Please say that again, please.
Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of Hashem. And he will turn back to God the hearts of fathers with their sons and the hearts of sons with their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with utter destruction.
Okay, now, who can read my mind? Who knows why I don't like that translation that Leon just said? Have a look at the Hebrew and tell me why I don't like that translation. And why yeah, there's a mistake in that translation. Anyone?
Yeah, through and with mean two completely different things, don't they? Is that, or have I missed the point?
No, I think you've partly got the point there, Avril, because what Leon said was, I will return to God the hearts of the fathers Is that what you said?
Yes.
Where in that verse does it say God? V'heishiv leiv avot al banim, v'leiv banim al avotam, v'navo v'keti et haaretz cherim. Where does it say God in that pasuk? It doesn't. Why have they put that in? Why has Art Scroll put that in? I have no idea. Well, I do have an idea, but I don't think it's right. That verse, and the reason I love that verse so much, is this is describing a time where the generation gap, and it doesn't matter whether it's fathers and children or teachers and pupils or elderly people and young people. Here, the idea is the generational thing. V'heishiv leiv avot al banim. I will return the hearts of the fathers upon the sons. V'leiv banim al avotam. And I'll return the hearts of the sons on their fathers. In other words, fathers and sons, young people and old people, will all be of one heart. At the moment, and certainly, you know, I was talking about this to somebody the other day, I can't remember in what context, but the generation gap that has always existed, but I think which was exacerbated massively from the 1960s onwards with youth culture and what have you, is a destructive force. I know the context. I remember now the context in which I was talking to. I was talking to somebody about one of my sons who works in the high-tech industry. And apparently in the high-tech industry today, the idea is that you move jobs as often as you possibly can so that you can progress your career. And of course, in our day, and I can say that because I think I'm the youngest here, apart from, no, I don't think I'm the youngest here. Avril's younger than me, I think. Avril Gatov is younger than me. No, you're not younger than me. Okay, so I'm the youngest here. Right, so in our day, the thing was you got a job and you got a job for life. Once you've got a good job, you were in that job for life. I remember getting my partnership in my practice and thinking, that's it. I'm done, job for life. And in the modern society, if you're in one job for more than 4 or 5 years, you're considered to be a duffer because you can't get another job. So it's just a total, that was the context in which I was talking about. And this pasuk talks about a time of a messianic time. The verse 23 says, I'll send you Eliyahu Navi before the day of the great and awesome day. That's Mashiach time, a messianic era. In other words, a time when which is an ideal time. It's a time that we look forward to. It's a time that we work towards. It doesn't matter whether you believe that Mashiach will come in on a white donkey or whether Mashiach is a mythical figure and the idea is that it's a utopian society or a society at peace with itself. Either way, that idea of a messianic utopian society at peace with itself, how is that described by Malachi? It's described with only one description. It's not Isaiah saying the nations will beat their plowshares, their swords into plowshares, and there'll be no war no more. That's Yeshaya, that's Isaiah. Malachi is saying here that what constitutes a messianic era is when the older generation and the younger generation are of one mind and one heart, and that the fathers are looking after sons, and more important, sons are looking after fathers. Young people are looking after old people. We know that old people can look after young people, but when young people are looking after old people in the same way, that is an ideal society. And that's why this verse is so beloved by me, that I think that Malachi is telling us here. He's telling us the secret of a messianic time. Messianic time means when you have harmony throughout the various different generations, when an old person cannot feel rejected like it does in various countries now that says, you know, ageism, if you're over 75, you're over 80, you don't get put on a ventilator. My own mother, when she went into hospital and got COVID, was not put on a ventilator because she was too old, right? So that old people are rejected. So when you've got a situation when old people are valued by the young people, and the young people are valued by the old people, and they don't say, oh, it's not like the youth of when I was a youth, look at this, you know, bring back the birch and all that kind of stuff. When we have that harmony between the generations, that, says Malachi, is a time we will know then that we have reached that messianic age. And that's why I'm particularly fond of this verse, which is the last verse of Malachi, who was the last prophet. So
I thought it happened last week, Johnny, when Facebook went down. I thought Mashiach was here.
yeah. I think a lot of people thought the end of the world had come. So you've got here a situation where we know we have an expression, don't we? Achron, achron, chaviv. And we say in English, last but not least. In Hebrew, achron, achron, chaviv. The last thing is the most beloved. That's why, you know, when you get the last bracha under the chuppah, and that's the best one to get because it's the last one. Here, this is the last psukim of the last prophet. Okay, this is the last bit of prophecy that God is leaving us with. Now, maybe I'm overplaying this, but that's how I view it. This is the last prophecy of the last prophet, and it's telling us how we need to behave. And it's all about harmony amongst families, fathers and sons, a generational thing. This is the way to have a messianic era. And that's why I love these psukim so much. And I wanted to take that opportunity of doing that just because our Gemarah mentioned Malachi. I never like to miss an opportunity to plug my message here on that. So just to recap, these Haggai, Malachi, and Zachariah, they were the pioneers of the return to Zion. They are the ones that encouraged the people to start the building of the second temple, to regain some kind of autonomy, to regain some religious centrality to their lives. And they were working in an environment which was very negative towards their views, and they need to be recognized as great prophets who were, as all great people who they tend to be swimming against the tide, don't they? It's all very easy to go along with with popular opinion, but when you are a person who of strong conviction and you are swimming against the tide of society, and you maintain your convictions and you encourage people to go in that direction, that shows the greatness of these people. So that's Malachi, Haggai, and Zachariah. And I think that sort of answers Sharon and Larry's question. They've actually gone. They told me they were going off somewhere after a little while, so they've not just fallen off. Hopefully they'll hear the recording. So let's go back to the Gemarah now and see what these three prophets were all about. Let me get the Gemarah back on the screen for you. There we go. Right, so Ruach HaKodesh, this prophecy, divine spirit of whatever it is, stopped at the time of the end of the first temple, beginning of the second temple. In other words, by the time the second temple had been built, there was no more prophecy. So we need to remember this, because it's often painted a picture of, particularly at Tisha B'Av time when we're mourning the destruction of the temple, we paint a picture of utopia during the period of the second temple. We tend to mourn the second temple more than the first temple because it's closer to us. We've got contemporaneous record of it in terms of Josephus and all the Roman writings about it, etc. We've got more information, obviously. It happened 500 years later than the first temple. But the real best times of Judaism, of not Judaism really, of the Am Yisrael, let's say, were the times of David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, times of even before the first temple and the beginning of the first temple. By the time the first temple had come to be destroyed, there was much corruption, there was much problems there. And shortly after the destruction of the first temple, this is what the Gemarah is telling us, there was no more prophecy. So the second temple was a pale imitation, in a way, of the first temple. There was no ark, there was no Aron HaKodesh. That was somewhere lost in the raiders of the lost ark. Somebody had raided it and it was lost. Never had an ark in the second temple. There were 10 miracles. If you read in Pirkei Avot, there were 10 miracles that happened in the first temple. They didn't happen in the second temple. So we just need to bear that in mind. So prophecy of some description, this Ruach HaKodesh stopped at that time. So there's no prophecy, no Ruach HaKodesh during the period of the second temple, and more importantly for our discussions, after the time of the second temple. What happened after the second temple, shortly after that, was the development of rabbinical Judaism. The temple was destroyed, and Rabbi Yochanan said to Vespasian, he was asked, he said, whatever you ask for, I'll give you your wish. And he said famously, give me Yavne v'chachameha, give me Yavne and its wise people. That was the development of rabbinic Judaism. Once the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, rabbinic Judaism started. And what we would call modern Judaism, whether it's Orthodox or Reform, is a descendant of rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism itself was a descendant of the Pharisees, the Perushim. You'll remember there were three main sects at that time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Sadducees were based in the temple. Once the temple was destroyed, their power base was gone, and they didn't last very long. The Essenes were a cultish people who practiced celibacy, so they never continued, obviously. And that left the Perushim, the Pharisees, a free run, really. And rabbinic Judaism is the descendants of the Pharisees, and we are descendants of rabbinic Judaism. And why am I telling you that? Because what this Gemarah is telling us is that there was no prophecy and no Ruach HaKodesh after the end of the first temple, meaning that after the end of the second temple, with all these Tanaim and all these Amorim, all these great rabbis, they were working on the basis of their own intelligence and their own learning, not from Ruach HaKodesh, because Ruach HaKodesh has finished 500 years earlier. And that's an important thing to remember. And now the reason it's so important to remember that is, and it's important that we remember it because it is forgotten by many people. These people were human beings. I'm talking about the Tanaim, the Amoraim, those that wrote the Mishnah and the Gemarah. They were human beings who were very clever human beings, but they were not prophets. There was no Ruach HaKodesh. There was no Nevuah. There was no prophecy. That's all finished. And therefore, they could be wrong. It's very difficult to say that a prophet is wrong. Okay, but you can say that the Amoraim or the Tanaim were wrong. For example, there is a famous Gemarah that says the Chachmei Yisrael, the rabbis of Israel, said the earth is flat. Well, we know the earth isn't flat. There are various other examples. If you want to go into this in great detail, read Natan Slifkin's book. It's what got him into trouble in 2004, saying that Gemarah was not compatible with modern day science. So it's important that we recognize that this Gemarah is a support for that view. There was no Nevuah, no prophecy, no Ruach HaKodesh at that time. However, let's go on in the Gemarah and see what there was. And it's a bit strange. Afal Pike, even though Hayu Mishtamshin Bat Kol, they would use a divine voice, Bat Kol. Now, Bat, it means what? Daughter. Yeah, we all know that. Bat means a daughter. Kol means a voice. So it's translated over here as a divine voice. The Art Scroll translation is, let's have a look. The Art Scroll translation is a heavenly voice. Okay. The literal translation means the daughter of a voice. Now let's see how lateral your thinking is. Forget Judaism now. If I said to you, what is the daughter of a voice? What would you say? What is the daughter of a voice?
Something weaker than a voice, isn't it?
Yes, good. It's weaker than a voice. What is a daughter? It's the next generation, isn't it? So you're doing great, Avril. Go on, carry on in your lateral thinking. It's weaker than a voice. What's the daughter of a voice?
So, I mean, there's presumably, I mean, daughter.
Or a son. It doesn't have to be a daughter. It could be a son.
A child has got the genetic material, if you're looking at it literally, of the parent, but it's obviously it's different mutated, and they change as well. So there are sort of changes going forward. So they interpret things and they.
Okay, good. All right. How about what happens to some sound if I shout at a wall or a mountain?
Echoes.
Echo. What is an echo?
It's a version of the voice. But
yeah, it's the next generation of the voice, isn't it? The voice or the sound is emitted, and as it were, the next generation of that sound, when it bounces off whatever it is and it comes back at you, it's an echo. A Bat Kol is really an echo. If you were to translate that accurately, Bat Kol is not a heavenly voice. It doesn't mention heaven. It doesn't say Kol Mishamayim. It's not a divine voice, as is written here, which it would be Kol Hashem, right? It's a Bat Kol. It's the next generation. It's an echo. Now, there's a whole load of discussion about what this Bat Kol is. Let's see that little N over there on the screen next to divine voice. That's Rabbi Steinsaltz pointing you to notes up the top here. And this is what he says. Several different explanations have been offered for the concept of a Bat Kol. Some explain that it's a kind of derivative of a true prophetic voice. So the true prophetic voice, the prophecy, would be the main thing. The Bat Kol, like Avril said, is the next generation down. It's a bit weaker. It's not quite got the same oomph. For although real prophecy ceased, the inspiration deriving from the divine spirit remained. So this is, if we think of prophecy as the divine spirit, a Bat Kol is that inspiration that we would get, that a person would get, who is able to be a very spiritual person. Somebody who, for example, those folk that like to go out into nature and to commune with nature, and they feel at one with the spirit and what have you, they can be inspired during those experiences, and they're inspired by this kind of divinity, if you like, wherever they see it. So one explanation is it's a weaker version of prophecy. It's a sort of an echo of prophecy. Another explanation is that sometimes a divine voice is a kind of echo, he says, or a voice that is heard without an identifiable origin. What's an echo? You don't actually know where it's come from, right? An echo, you hear an echo and you think, where'd that come from? You're disorientated from its origin. At other times, it may be the voice of people speaking normally about certain matters, but the content of their speech includes the answer to a pressing question for the one who hears the speech. So in other words, if I've got a particularly difficult problem and I go to a particularly clever person and they cogitate on my problem and come up with a really clever answer, I might consider that to have been an inspired answer. We might even use that expression in English, mightn't we? Inspired from where? Well, that was inspired from nowhere. I don't know where it came from. I remember that something's just popped into my head actually now, very interesting. I remember being on a ward round as a medical student. And as a medical student, this may surprise you to know, I wasn't the greatest student. I was not really interested in studying books and sitting down and hitting the books. I like to learn on the job. So I loved the ward rounds, but I didn't usually know any of the answers to the questions that were being asked by the consultant because I hadn't done the background reading that was necessary. Of course, I've changed since then, but that was what I was like as a student. And I remember being on a ward round. I can remember it perfectly. So I must have been 20 and I'm now 62. So I'm remembering something perfectly from 42 years ago, approximately. The consultant took us round the ward and there was a patient on the ward who had been on steroids. And no, beg your pardon. The patient was suffering from depression. And the consultant said, what are the causes of depression? And all the clever people in the group, all the people that had done the hard work, reeled off from their memories all the lists of the causes of depression that they'd read in the books. And I stayed stum. And then when they got to the end of the list, the consultant said, yeah, that's all correct. But there's something else as well. What else causes depression? And out of nowhere, popped out of my mouth, steroids. And the consultant turned to me and said, excellent, Lieberman, steroids. And that's what this patient was on. This patient was on steroids and he'd got all depressed from it, etc. I had no idea where that word came from. I didn't know the answer. I had nothing. And that was, I suppose, what this is talking about when it says an answer comes and you don't know where it's come from. I had no idea where that came from. Must have been a previous incarnation of myself that knew that, because I certainly didn't know it and hadn't read it. And I think that's what this is sort of, when you get an idea, that's a very mundane example. But when something comes into your head out of nowhere, that can be a Bat Kol. So Rabbi Steinsaltz's little explanation here, I think, is very, very useful, because what he's telling us is that there are several different explanations. And of course, we know our general rule, don't we? Which I think we should rename as Pechter's rule. Pechter's rule states that the more explanations there are for something, the less satisfactory any of them are. And so the more explanations there are, they realize we don't really know what it is. But we don't know what a Bat Kol is, but there are various different explanations, and all of them are useful to know, because at certain times we'll experience this kind of Bat Kol. So let's go back to our Gemara. So there's no prophet.
No modern day prophets, Johnny.
Beg your pardon, Johnny?
Do you really think there are no modern day prophets like the Rebbe, who has told people this will happen and that will happen? I'm not a Chabadnik, by the way. But I know the Rebbe said so many things to people that have come true. Have they got a Bat Kol?
I think there's no question that the Rebbe was a very special, intuitive person. And I think that what this Gemara is saying is that people like the Rebbe, who were able to be inspired, if you like, were able to tune in to this Bat Kol. We have to accept the concept that true prophecy, I mean, if I was to come along on Friday night in the drosha and I was to say, I received a vision from God yesterday. Ko Amar Hashem, so says God. And I was to tell you all sorts of things. You'd be quite right to ring up the loony bin and have me carted off. Do you know how many Jesuses I've visited in psychiatric wards over the years? It's a very common psychosis to think that you are the Mashiach, or that you are God, or that God has sent you. And what happens to people today who say that God has sent them is they get locked up in loony bins, right? Because it's a psychosis. So in today's society, that concept of God has sent me, I had a message from God to go and do this, that, and the other. That's how, you know, people who commit crimes, serious crimes, nebuch. I mean, it's a terrible thing. It's a terrible illness. People who are psychotic and get these visions and hear these voices from God, that's not nevuah. Somebody like the Rebbe who's got this intuition, this inspiration, I think is tuning into this Bat Kol. So no, I don't think there are modern day prophets, but I think there are people who are able, and I think that Jonathan Sacks was one of those as well, who was able to, with his great intellect and with his great mind, was able to be inspired to ideas and concepts and work, if you like, that others, mere mortals, were not. So that's my take on it, but you know, it's only my take on it. You know,
Can I just say, Johnny, that seems to fit in with the idea of the echo, because an echo can go on and on and on, and it can become weaker. But we don't know where the echo can be heard or felt. So it's sort of resonates.
That's a nice idea. Yes, that's a very nice idea. If you take the example of the Rebbe, for example, his echoes have gone beyond his life, as is Jonathan Sacks. I'm going to be sending out to you in the next week or so a flyer for the Yortzeit memorial program that Chela is putting on together with Matan in Ra'anana, and these things are going on around the world. One of the things that's going around the world on Rabbi Sacks's Yortzeit is a 24-hour learning program. When I say 24 hours, I mean starting in New Zealand and going through all the time zones, all the way through to the west coast of the US. So you're going through every time zone in the world, and there's going to be learning throughout every time zone, throughout every world. As the day progresses, starting in New Zealand and working away across the Australian continent, and then working its way westwards. And that is an echo, isn't it? That's the echo of Rabbi Sacks's work, because what we're all going to be learning is stuff that he's written, his ideas, and that's the echo. And in some ways, Rabbi Sacks was an echo of the Rebbe. Rabbi Sacks was very influenced by the Rebbe. Yeah. And if you like, I've been very influenced by Rabbi Sacks. And maybe two of you will be influenced by what you've learned in these shiurim. And that, you know, that is the way the echo continues. So I think you're right, Avril. I hadn't thought of that, but I think that fits in beautifully with the idea of the echo, that the Bat Kol is an echo of previous generations' greatness, if you like. And I suppose that what we have to do is to be discerning and to tap into those echoes, to be able to hear the echo. Sometimes it's quite hard to hear an echo. Sometimes it's hard to make out what an echo is saying. And I suppose our job in each generation is to discern those echoes of great people from previous generations, and then to perpetuate that echo. So I certainly like that idea very much. And if I have time, I might make that into a little Techelet 5-minute video for the Yortzeit of Rabbi Sacks. And that will be in your zechut, Avril, if I manage to get round to doing that. Thank you very much.
You listened to Tony Blair about speaking about Rabbi Sacks.
Yeah.
Very good. Hear it? Yes, I listened to it all.
Very good.
Very good.
I thought it was excellent.
Excellent.
Let's finish off by actually learning about one of these Bat Kols, okay? Banot Kol, I suppose one should call them. The plural of bat is banot. Leon, are you waving at me, or are you just sticking your hand?
Yes, no, I'm waving at you. I've had my hand up a little while. Just going back to the plethora of explanations, none of which are particularly acceptable. It's interesting that the art scroll doesn't give one explanation at all. It merely says, however, they no longer heard the heavenly voice itself.
Okay, so let's just. I think there's a political reason for that, and of course, and that is that the Art Scroll is a very Haredi-based organization, if you like, and the Haredi approach is one of accepting of miracles happening and people having Ruach HaKodesh. It's sort of, it's accepted. Rashi had Ruach HaKodesh. I say Rashi did not have Ruach HaKodesh because I'm quoting the Gemarah. I believe in the Gemarah. These people don't believe in the Gemarah. They believe that Ruach HaKodesh still exists, even though we've just read quite clearly that it didn't. So they would say a heavenly voice is a heavenly voice. That's it. I don't have a problem with people hearing heavenly voices. I personally do have a problem with people hearing heavenly voices. But what's interesting is, Leon, on the other hand, the Art Scroll says they never heard the heavenly voice itself. So what they're hearing, an echo of it, maybe. So maybe in some ways, even though they're not saying they're hearing the voice itself, they're hearing some derivative of it. They have to say that because a bat means a derivative of, doesn't it? It's a daughter of, it's a derivative of. But it is interesting that that's what we would see often, isn't it? That a particular approach is favored by a particular author, and therefore that's the approach that they would say. You don't put your when you were working as a lawyer, you didn't put your opponent's view forward. You left that for your opponent to do. You put your view forward. Yes, Julia, you're muted.
Yeah, I am muted. It just seems to me it's quite interesting that it's a bat rather than Ben. I mean, when we just read Malachi, and you were talking about the generations and the getting closer and the generation gap disappearing, that was all fathers and sons. And all of a sudden, we're introducing women into it, which I don't have an answer, but it seems to me that surely there must be a reason for it. And maybe what they are actually saying, I don't know, Avril originally used the word weak, and I don't like to do that in association with women, but I'm looking at context, and I'm just wondering if it was indicative that it was much less something less significant, much less significant than the divine spirit, because I just find it quite odd that we're talking about daughters all of a sudden.
Isn't that interesting? Because I hadn't thought about it, why it isn't a Ben Kol and it's a Bat Kol. But as you were speaking, and before you said the negative aspect of it, that it's a reflection of it being weak, I was thinking of something very positive. And it's very interesting that here's the man thinking of the bat as something very positive, and I'll tell you what I was thinking in a second, and the woman who's thinking of it as something negative. I'm thinking a bat, why is it a Bat Kol? Never occurred to me, but as you were speaking, I'm thinking, and what popped into my head, maybe it was a Bat Kol, I don't know, but what popped into my head was that women are much more intuitive than men. Men are much more reflective, I mean, they don't mean reflective, I mean reflexive. In other words, they act on instinct and on reflex, as opposed to women who are much more intuitive, perhaps much more in tune with spiritual matters. And I was thinking that maybe it's a Bat Kol because women are more likely to be receptive to that sort of inspiration than men. So I thought, maybe nonsense, but that's what I thought. And it's interesting to me that I thought of something positive and you thought of something negative.
Yeah, but with respect, the two people that you've used as examples are men, the Rebbe and Lord Sachs. And if you can think of a woman, well, who is it? Well, I'm not really trying to be negative. What I'm trying to suggest that this is contextual, and we know that women are not thought of very highly at this period of time. And we know, well, we do know, especially going back to last week's, when the poor woman was having to get a get from a load of different people, and she wasn't given any any respect at all for not naming the person. And I can't for 1 minute believe that she didn't know the name of the person, which was something I didn't mention in my text, but thought about afterwards. So I know that this is the context that women have little respect at this period in time.
Okay, I accept that, but I would say this before we ask Avril's view. She's got her hand up. Oh, it's gone down again, but it can go up again in a sec. I would just say this. Here, clearly, a Bat Kol is something extremely positive. It's a heavenly voice. It's a message from God in one way or another. That can't be in any way construed as negative. And if you would have said to me, for example, if it had said Ben Kol, and you had said to me, why does it say Ben Kol? Why doesn't it say Bat Kol? It's not only men that get heavenly voices, you know. I would have said that's a fair criticism. I think the fact that it says Bat Kol is not, I don't see it as a negative thing. But you're right about context and everything. You're definitely right about that. I don't think this is an example, personally, I don't think this is an example of the reflection of women being treated badly, although I do agree that women were treated badly in context at this time. Avril.
I was going to say that it occurred to me that it was like it was more Kabbalistic, that the Shekhinah is sometimes described as feminine, and it's the noun is in the feminine, and I was thinking about it as being like that, sort of more the derivative of the Shekhinah, and that's why it's Bat, because of Kabbalistic connotations.
And of course, Shekhinah itself is a feminine word.
Yes, that's what I thought.
Interesting. It'd be interesting to know what everybody else's thoughts are. Maybe we can have a discussion about this on the WhatsApp group. Just before we go, I know we were over time. I just want to mention and go through this first Bat Kol that the Gemarah mentions, so you can see what we're talking about, and then we'll go over it in detail next week. So they had this Bat Kol. Pa'am achat. It happened once. Hayu masubin ba'aliyat Beit Guria b'Yericho. They were lounging about, masubin, that's the same word we do as on Pesach, of course, when we lean. They were lounging about in the loft space. Aliyah is the loft space of this place called Beit Guria, the house of Guria in Jericho. V'nitna alehem Bat Kol min hashamayim. And they got a heavenly voice from Shamayim, from heaven, right? They got a divine voice from heaven. It doesn't say who they are, actually, at this point. And it said, Yesh kan echad, one of you here, shero tishre alav shchina. There's your word, Avril. Kamo Moshe Rabbeinu. One of you here is fitting that the divine presence should rest upon him like Moshe Rabbeinu. So in other words, this heavenly voice says, you lot that are all here in this room, one of you is a very special person. Okay? And the only reason that he's not got Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy on him is because his generation, otherwise the rest of the people around you, are not worthy of it. And I want to go into in detail next week the ramifications of that. Okay, so that's what they said. This heavenly voice came and said, out of you 5 rabbis that are sitting around here, one of you is a special guy, only he can't reveal himself as a special guy because the rest of you are not worthy of it. Okay, so then Naknu Chachamim et Eineihem. The Chachamim, the rabbis, looked around, and who did they look at? Hillel Hazakein, Hillel the elder, and we'll talk about him next week in detail. And they all said, it must be him. He's the guy that's like Moshe Rabbeinu. Ukeshemet Amru Alav, and when he died, when Hillel the elder died, he Chassid, he Anav, he was a pious person, he was a humble person, and he was Talmido Shel Ezra. He was a disciple of Ezra, which is an introduction next week, please God, into the personality of Ezra as well. So that was the story that went on, a weird story. They're sitting around, God says, or a voice from heaven says, one of you is Moshe Rabbeinu's equal, but the rest of you are not worthy of it. And they all thought it was Hillel. So that's what we're going to discuss next time. Yes, Jeffrey?
Well, what were they doing in Jericho? I always thought Jericho was a bad place. It was a haven for sin. And it sounds like it was the Las Vegas of Eretz Yisrael. So I don't think those blokes really should have been there if they were so pious.
I'd never thought of that, why they were in Jericho. Of course, Jericho was destroyed and we were told never to rebuild it.
Exactly. So what the hell were they doing there?
I don't know.
They were hiding in a loft. That's why they were living upstairs in a loft in secret.
They're in the penthouse. What are you on about? It's another word for penthouse.
It's a good question, Jeffrey. I've no idea. Never thought of it. I'll see if I can do some digging around and see why they were in Jericho.
You won't be the first to go digging at Jericho.
No doubt. Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have everybody back. I hope that's been a little taster of this stuff for next week. Anybody that wants to listen to it all again, it will be available on the recording, of course. And anybody that wants to give their views on what a Bat Kol versus a Ben Kol, we have our Gemarah Sanhedrin WhatsApp group. Anybody who's not on that WhatsApp group that wants to be on it, just let me know and I'll put you on it. See you all. I've got to switch off now because the builders are about to switch off the electricity.